So I recorded this video before the Russo brothers came out and confirmed the meaning behind Captain America's ending in Avengers Endgame. But what's funny about that is that my theory originally lined up with what they said anyway, but I did have a second theory as to how a time loop would have worked with Cap's ending. But this video is still relevant, hope you guys do enjoy, but we now have confirmation as to what the true meaning behind Captain America's ending is. Enjoy the video. Welcome everyone to Marvel Hub. This is DK Dynamite, and today we're going to be going in depth in regards to how Steve Rogers returned all 6 Infinity Stones and stayed in the past to live out his life before returning to our timeline as an old man. The rules established in Avengers Endgame, and more specifically the time travel rules, really do clarify how all of this works and fits in perfectly at the end of the film, but could easily be misinterpreted by casual viewers, people who didn't pay attention, people who are stuck on time travel rules from different movies, etc. And it's perfectly understandable, and I'm happy to be breaking that down here in today's video. So, as they joke about in the film, movies like Back to the Future, Hot Tub Time Machine, and many others kind of have this very linear timeline in those movies' universes, where if you affect the past, it'll affect your future, and you essentially can't mess with the past, or else it'll cause a paradox, the universe explodes, and all those funny things that come along with it. So essentially, you can't ruin the past, because then your future will be doomed. And that's how all those movies really play out. But the rules in the MCU when it comes to time travel are far different. Changing the past does not affect your future, but instead creates a ripple effect and creates new timelines, new branches, and really does go in depth with the multiverse. And the Ancient One perfectly explains that at the beginning of the movie when Bruce Banner tries to come and take the Time Stone, because she thinks that if Bruce Banner takes the Time Stone from her just for his sake, to save his timeline, it'll just doom her timeline, since then it'll create a different branch in reality and she'll be living in an alternate timeline, an alternate universe where there isn't a time stone. And as she explains, when you're missing one out of the 6 Infinity Stones, it kind of dooms space and time as we know it for that timeline. But what Bruce does is convinces her to give it to him, because the science or the quantum realm is what can save the universe. And what that means is he'll then be returning the stones right where they belong in the past, so that those alternate timelines don't kind of converge, don't kind of go off and do their own thing and create some type of hell alternate reality. So instead, they'd return the stones where they belong, so that eventually those timelines then merge back with our timeline, changing nothing. But the problem with that is that that was the goal in the movie, but unfortunately that didn't work out exactly as they planned. First off, we have Loki escaping with the Tesseract, which automatically creates an alternate timeline right there that they definitely can't fix and merge with their own timeline again. You have the Power Stone being taken, which is fine, but then even though they knocked Quill out, the Thanos and Nebula in that timeline are now dead, the 2014 timeline. So that creates another timeline as well. So there's a lot of things in the movie that they try to establish, but they clearly fail at certain points. But that's not to say it's bad writing or bad storytelling. They failed in the sense that now there is a multiverse, now there are alternate timelines that do exist, but in reality, some of the other timelines they messed with, like the one from Thor the Dark World 2013 Asgard, and maybe the one on Vormir, and some of those timelines can easily merge with our own, so that those don't go off and branch off into their own timelines, if that makes sense. So in terms of how Steve Rogers returns all the stones in the film, here's how this worked. He had a briefcase at the end of the movie containing all 6 Infinity Stones, right? And they're all in their crystal forms. They're not in the original forms that we all know from phases 1, 2, and early phase 3. So people are wondering, how can Steve then return the Tesseract back to the 1970s if it's in his crystal form? So I'll give an easy answer to that. Maybe he returns the Time Stone first to the Sanctum, to the Ancient One in New York 2012. Maybe he returns the Time Stone first, and she uses the Time Stone on the Space Stone to then turn it back into the Tesseract, so that he could then take the Tesseract back to the SHIELD facility in the 1970s. That's an easy explanation, because I'm sure he won't just return a blue crystal instead of the Tesseract back to the SHIELD facility in the 1970s, or else that timeline won't eventually merge back into our main timeline, and instead it'll cause a completely different and alternate reality in that 1970s timeline. I'm sure that's what happened, but When it comes to the Power Stone, all you had to do was put it back in that orb, place it back on Morag, I believe the planet is called, place it back in there so that Quill eventually wakes up after being knocked out by War Machine and then goes and finds it like usual, and then the events of Guardians 1 do play out. The only problem with that is that while that would work and while that would eventually merge that timeline with our main one, the Thanos and Nebula in that timeline are dead, so that nothing in the first Guardians movie would ever take place. Now, that doesn't affect our MCU, that doesn't affect our timeline and our main events that have occurred in every phase, but in that specific timeline, in that 2014 version of Guardians 1, nothing will be the same and nothing will take place the way that we all know. So that is an alternate reality, an alternate timeline that is to stay, but that's not to say that that's going to be the alternate timeline we're sticking with going forward. That did not affect our future and our main timeline that we all know and love. Now, when it comes to the Soul Stone, that's when things get very interesting, because how do you return the Soul Stone back to Vormir? The tower is at Vormir. The Red Skull is no longer guarding it because he was freed after the Soul Stone was obtained. Now, the movie did say very explicitly that you cannot undo or reverse the sacrifices that you make for the Soul Stone. So maybe Steve goes there, somehow places the Soul Stone at the bottom there where Nat's dead body is, and somehow the Soul Stone gets absorbed into the towers of Vormir. Red Skull is forced to return to guard it again, but Nat's death unfortunately cannot be reversed. Maybe that's what happens. Not exactly sure, but as I pointed out in a previous video, it's slightly a missed opportunity to get a reunion with Captain America and the Red Skull. It would have been sick to see, but I'm sure they chose not to do that for a very specific reason. But once again, the movie explicitly expresses that those deaths can't be undone. Hawkeye literally says it right after Black Widow is killed when Thor's asking him why they can't go and get Nat back. They can't do it. And I guess Infinity War purposely didn't kind of express that when it comes to bringing back Gamora, at least, because apparently everybody's stuck in the Soul Stone, you can bring them out. Well, this movie explicitly says that you cannot reverse those deaths. So apparently off screen, the Red Skull told Hawkeye that it cannot be undone even if you return the Soul Stone. So since Steve wants to go back and return it, obviously you can return it, but I guess those deaths just can't be reversed, which really does suck, which kind of goes against previous fan theories that apparently Gamora was in the Soul Stone and she could be taken out. I guess that's not the case, unfortunately, which really does suck. So I'll talk about this later, but apparently in Guardians 3 they'll be searching for Gamora, which has no memory of everything that went down within Guardians 1 and 2, which is kind of a downer, but could make for some great storytelling. So besides the Soul Stone now, we have the Reality Stone, or the Ether. This is a very interesting one now, because people are wondering, how can you then inject the Ether back into Jane? Well, the same device they used to extract it from her can probably be used to put it back in her. And remember, it was only a second after the stones were taken that they're placed right back where they belong in the past. So at least in the 2013 version of Asgard, if Steve were to inject Jane with the Ether again and then he leaves, it had only been 1 second where Jane didn't have the Ether in her, which changes nothing in that timeline, and everything in that timeline still stays intact and still eventually merges with our timeline, where Frigga gets killed by the Dark Elf, where Jane eventually gets rid of the Ether, and then Malekith has it. So everything in that timeline will stay the same. Nothing dramatically changed in the 2013 version of Asgard, which means once again it'll eventually merge with our timeline, changing nothing and not branching off to be its own alternate reality. So then when it comes to the Mind Stone, this one's interesting as well. So since Hydra, or S.H.I.E.L.D. as to say, eventually grabbed Loki's scepter at the end of the Battle of New York, and then Baron von Strucker then had it in Avengers Age of Ultron, that can still happen. All they have to do is return the scepter back to the Hydra agents that were secretly undercover in S.H.I.E.L.D., which works out perfectly. The only problem is that that won't prevent that timeline from branching off into its own, because remember, Loki escaped with the Tesseract at the very end of that scene, which means that, sure, the scepter is still where it belongs and it'll still merge with our timeline when Baron von Strucker gets it, but the Tesseract is not in possession of Thor when he goes back to Asgard, which can change a lot. So keep in mind, some timelines stay intact, some of them merge with our own, while others, like the one where Loki escapes with the Tesseract, like the one where Thanos and Nebula die in 2014, those branch off into their own alternate realities, their own timelines, which can have a completely separate group of events that didn't already occur in the MCU, which is pretty crazy to think about, but once again, simply introduces the multiverse. It does not mean that all of a sudden we're going to explore those alternate timelines later down the line. Well, we might explore the Loki one because of his TV show, but when it comes to the 2014 version of Guardians 1, where Thanos and Nebula are dead, they're probably not going to go in depth with that. All we're going to go in depth with in Guardians 3 is the fact that Gamora's still alive. She has no memory of what happened because she's from the 2014 timeline that jumped to 2023. They'll probably be looking for her and kind of touching base with her again, trying to remind her of who she actually is, even though she doesn't remember. That's the most we'll probably get from the 2014 version of events that are now different. So that's a pretty solid explanation of how Steve returned the Infinity Stones at the end of Avengers Endgame. Clearly, wherever he transported to first probably had a ship there waiting for him so he can travel from planet to planet, getting his things done. Probably took him a few hours at best, and once he did that, he decided to go back to the past and live out his life with Peggy. Now keep this in mind now, people are still somehow confused about this even though the rules were clearly established. In the timeline or in the past, when he goes to live with Peggy, that does not affect his future that we all know in the MCU. That does not prevent him from being Captain America. That does not prevent him from joining the Avengers eventually. He does all of that and lives his life out with Peggy in an alternate timeline that happens to take place in the past. So the issue with that is this though. Either Steve sits by, lives his life with Peggy, and doesn't do anything to prevent the infiltration of S.H.I.E.L.D. by Hydra, the Winter Soldier. Either he sits by and lets all of that happen, knowing that it'll all be okay in the future, or he somehow does change all those events in that timeline, and sure, everything plans out perfectly, everything works out, he prevents all the fucking major, national disasters. Maybe that all happens, and then he comes back to our timeline to pass the torch on to Sam. Maybe that does happen, except for one little thing in there, and this is what's left up to interpretation at the end of Avengers Endgame. How did Old Man Steve make it to that bench right where present Steve ended up transporting or time traveling away from? How did Old Man Steve end up there? Did he use the quantum realm later in his life when he was an old man to kind of time travel back to the time when present Steve ends up leaving and then sits at that bench and waits for present Steve to leave so that Sam and Bucky can notice him? Is that what he really did? Did he save his Pym particles until he was old enough when Peggy passed away so that then he could travel back to the present and pass on the torch? Or did he do something else, which people might not agree with, but maybe Steve went back to that alternate timeline, lived his life out with Peggy, but absolutely 100% didn't change a damn thing, let everything go on as it's supposed to, and then somehow, since he did that, that timeline then merged with the actual timeline so that he kind of lived out all through the events of the MCU as an old man, saw everything go on before his eyes, knowing that everything will be okay, but since the timeline merged, he could exist at the same time as the present Steve that we all know and love. So then he just sits at that bench waiting for present Steve to leave so that then he could be noticed. But people are confused by that because that means he retcons Agent Carter's family. So I guess that's true, but people are suggesting right now that in the Winter Soldier, since they don't explicitly state who Peggy's husband was, who Steve saved in World War II to then become Peggy's husband, because they don't explicitly say that, could leave the door open to end up saying, you know what, Steve was her husband the entire time. But the way the rules work in this movie is that it's pretty clear that this isn't a time loop. And people are saying that, oh, it could be an easy time loop, easy to understand. And that's very true, it is easy to understand, but the way that the rules are established in the film really make it out to be that there are alternate timelines, and some timelines you don't touch too much can end up merging with your own, while the ones you do touch too much end up going off into their own alternate realities and alternate timelines. That's kind of the interpretation I got with the rules in this movie, so it could be one of two things. As I said, Steve went back to the past, changed everything he wanted to, prevented Hydra from infiltrating S.H.I.E.L.D., prevented all the bad stuff from happening, and created a beautiful, perfect world in that timeline, lived his life out with Peggy, Peggy passes away, and then, using Pym particles, travels back to our timeline to pass the S.H.I.E.L.D. onto Sam. That's a good theory right there, and it's pretty easy to understand, but the other theory is that Steve actually lived out in the past with Peggy, changed nothing to ensure that that timeline then merges with our own, so that eventually he's an old man, he's sitting at that bench, not having to use the Pym particles at all because he's in the same timeline as us now, which does work, so to speak. But you can let me know what you think of that down below in the comments section. Once again, again, as a quick reminder, time travel does not exist in real life, so there are no rules that are right or wrong. These movies, these franchises, these comic books can all establish time travel rules in the way that they want to. There are no right or wrong answers, so all you have to do is pay attention to the time travel rules that were established in this movie to understand how all of this works. But keep in mind, as all comic book stories usually do, they introduce the timelines, alternate timelines, the multiverse, paradoxes. All comic book stories usually do this, so I'm not surprised the MCU finally got their feet wet with a storyline like this. But I also think Cap's ending is left open to interpretation, but easily fits in with the rules that were established, and I absolutely love it. But I hope you guys found this helpful. That was the easiest and most condensed explanation I could possibly give you guys as to how Steve returned the Infinity Stones without causing any major damage, how alternate timelines work, and how Steve lived his life out in the past with Peggy, which is still open for interpretation. But that's about it. This has been DK Dynamite. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and turn notifications on to stay up to date with the latest and greatest Marvel news and information. And peace out, everyone.